The United States makes the UN work when it wants it to work. And that is exactly the way it should be, because the only question for the United States is what's in our national interest.
My name is John, and the International Criminal Court is back in session. It is December 12th, 2025, and once again we are going to look at the situation within Ukraine. So, let's start. First of all, we are going to talk about the elephant in the room. I mean, I have to. I literally have no choice but to address this. And that is the situation in Kupyansk. Now, Kupyansk, which is a pretty sizable city within the Kharkiv region, has been contested by the Russians since August 2025. And their main pathway into Kupyansk was through Kindrashovka and Radkovka. They also seized control too of Moskovka and Sobolovka, and even were taking some parts too of Sadove. But in recent months or so, the armed forces of Ukraine began to realize that there weren't really many Russians in this area, or perhaps the claims that have been given to the Russian Ministry of Defense, and therefore to the rest of us, had been complete lies. And it's because of this, it turned out that many of these areas here were never under Russian control, like consolidated Russian control whatsoever at all. Instead, it was either a contested gray zone, or perhaps the Russians just were never there to begin with. Like, Ukrainians always had control of it. And even if the Russians did control it at some point, they clearly didn't have enough manpower to stop any future Ukrainian counterattacks, and instead heavily relied on the use of, once again, FPV drones to slow down any Ukrainian attempts at entering the city of Kupyansk from the western side, that is. And the last thing that I know, based on all of the updates provided by Deep State, who is a very controversial pro-Ukrainian source and such, along with Syriac, who updated Kupyansk earlier today, they are suggesting that the Russians now have lost a big chunk of Kupyansk itself on the western side. Not on the eastern side, but on the western side. And as far as I know, the Russians no longer have proper control over the western portion of the city, which is the main part. That's where the Central Rada building is. That's where all the commie blocks are. I mean, it's literally the main part of Kupyansk, where all the people live. And apparently Deep State claimed that these villages here are now under AFU control once again, and that they have put the Russian soldiers within Kupyansk city into some pocket. If this were to be true, then it would obviously be the Russian army's biggest frontline disaster since the infamous attempted assault into Ugledar, in which Russian tanks literally tried to bum rush into the town of Ugledar, which is right here, and they all got destroyed easily by the armed forces of Ukraine's defenses that were based in the town of Ugledar. But in a way, this is much worse, because the Russians were never able to take almost any part, major part of Ugledar. Here, they were able to do that, and despite all that hard work that was done in the last 4 or 5 months, it now looks like it could be, wasted. And if I'm, the everyday soldier right now for the Russian army in Zapad Group, which is the group responsible for the situation in Kupyansk, I'd be very super pissed. I mean, not only did you not only have enough manpower, but you also did not secure your flanks. That is literally what you're supposed to do. That's what Group Center did. That's what Vostok did. That's what, even Group North did too. Zapad really screwed up here. Now, the extent to their screw-up is still up in the air. And if the Russians do lose Western Kupiansk and are forced to fall back to the eastern side of the Oska River, then I'm sure the Russians, in the long term, are going to be like, okay, we're going to have to obviously clear all of this out first before we can attempt another assault into Western Kupiansk again. But here's the thing, there's still a lot of land to go through. They don't have Kucherovka under their complete control, neither Petropavlovka. They also don't have Pischany, they don't have Kurilovka, they don't have Kivshorovka, they don't have Kupyansk Vuzlavi, they don't even have Glushkovka, too, under their control. So there is still a lot of work for the Russians to be done in, like, the eastern side of the Oska River in the Kupiansk direction. The fact that they have only focused on trying to take Kupiansk itself and not clear this whole pocket is just mind-boggling. That is something you don't do. If the Russians were able to have all this locked down and then go into Kupiansk, then there's a good chance that they could have been able to not only stabilize the situation here much more easily, but also prevent any successful Ukrainian counterattacks from materializing. So they now seem to be on the path where they'll have to start all over from square one. Like, they're being forced back to where they essentially started in the summer or so. But again, if they're able to clear this pocket here, then it's not a complete loss. It's like hundreds or so square kilometers within the Kharkiv region. And I'm sure that even if they were to lose Western Kupiansk and get all this, then maybe losing this was a worthwhile short-term sacrifice. But still, there is no excuse. No excuse whatsoever. If you don't hold on to your flanks, then you're going to lose your main target. And that is, of course, Kupiansk. What more can I say that literally hasn't been said already by pro-Russian accounts that are observing this fiasco? Now, for all I know, maybe the situation could turn around quickly, and then what we're talking about now will just seem like a silly memory months down the line. But as far as I'm concerned right now for the Russians, it doesn't really look too good. Now, fortunately for Zapad Group, the North Group is bailing them out in other areas, especially along the border with Russia, like right here, that is. Now, I don't know if the Ukrainians are going to try to retake Dvorchina. I don't think they're going to try to retake it back. I felt like they only wanted to make a statement or something in Kupiansk just to prove to Donald Trump that they can still win or something. I feel like that was partly the reason why they wanted to go for this city here, because it is defensively the most vulnerable, and also it's, I mean, again, as I said, it's literally the most doable thing that they can do. It's so weak. There's like next to almost no roads into Kupiansk. And before you talk about this bridge here, it's already been destroyed by the Russians many times. Yeah, I don't really know what else to say other than big oof. Now, moving away from that, let's talk about other sections of the front, all right? Let's talk about Siversk. After 3 years of being arguably the armed forces of Ukraine's best defensive holdout outside of the Lugansk region, more specifically outside of the cities of Severodonetsk and the Lysychansk, which was taken by Russia easily in summer of 2022, the Ukrainians held out for a very long time in Siversk, which in turn made any offensives into Slavyansk and the Kramatorsk next to impossible. But a couple or so days ago, Siversk has finally fallen to Russia. Deep State, in fact, has over half of the town under Russian control, along with the commie blocks here, which are probably in ruins by now, but it doesn't matter. Siversk as a whole has fallen to Russia, and if you ask me, this is going to open up a road into recapturing the town or city of Liman from the Ukrainians. So despite the L's that Zapad has been taking up north in Kharkiv region, the Russians could as well make up for their issues in Kupyansk, well, more specifically the Zapad group that is, by recapturing Liman. And now that Siversk has been captured, it now seems very doable for the Russians to retake Liman. I honestly don't know what the Ukrainians can now do without Siversk, because all of this is probably easily going to fall to the Russians across all of winter. And also it seems as if the Russians are trying to outflank the Ukrainians outside of Liman by going through this forested area here, and then they'll just cut off this road and bridge here that would go into Slovyansk and the Kramatorsk. I mean, once they retake Liman and reach this bridge here, the Russians will fire a bunch of FPV drones into Slovyansk itself. And as all of you remember, the Russian separatist groups, the Donetsk People's Republic Militia, actually took control of Slovyansk in the 2014 phase of the war in Donbas. But, however, they were not able to hold on to this city, and they were forced to evacuate to Donetsk city. They lost Slovyansk, they lost Kramatorsk, they lost, I think, also Konstantinovka, Druskovka, and they were all forced to evacuate to Donetsk city, where they set up shop for the next 8 years, before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia itself. But yeah, so now with Siversk gone, it is now possible for Group South, or Group Yug that is, because South and Yug are the same, it's just in a different language. It is now possible for the Russians to advance towards Slovyansk from the east, though they will have to cross not only the Sovietsky Donets River, but they would also have to take Liman too, as I said earlier. So once Liman is retaken by the Russians, then we can start talking about not just also Slovyansk being a target next year, but also the southern half of the pocket here in the Kharkiv region on the eastern side of the Oska River, and more specifically the town of Borova being a target for the Russians. I am expecting Borova to fall in 2026. I don't know when, but I'm expecting it to fall next year. I mean, it would be inexcusable for Zapad not to capture it in 2026. Like, I don't know what can really stop them by this point once Liman is gone. But as soon as it's taken care of, then they're definitely going to advance towards the Oska River here. And then they'll try a crossing to retake the city of Izium, which is one of the strategic cities in the Kharkiv region and the main gateway to Donbas from the north, which would effectively make supplying Slovyansk itself next to impossible for the Ukrainians. Like, they would have only one or two or even just like 3 ways to supply it, but they're running out of time. And they better hope negotiations come very fast, because if they're not able to get a deal done by like spring or summer of 2026, then Slovyansk is pretty much cooked. Like, literally. And if you want me to explain why that is, let's move on to the next portion of the front, and that is Konstantinovka itself. So, as you guys know, Group Yug successfully took Siversk in a matter of a month or so. But in recent times, the Russians have continued their push in the city of Konstantinovka and its outskirts. So, they have taken control over most of the southeastern neighborhoods in the city, and have also reportedly started advancing westward towards the village of Berystok, which is right outside of central Konstantinovka itself. So, these fields that were seized by the Russians were reported by our favorite alcoholic, Anatoly Radov. And say all you want about him, but he's mostly accurate in the grand scheme of things. And the only screw-ups he really does is when, I don't know, I guess when he's drunk or something. But otherwise, I think he's right 75 to 90% of the time. And because of how reliable he can be, I decided to paint this area too in favor of the Russians. So the Russians are trying to clear this area, like south of Konstantinovka, out. And once they're able to, then yeah, the Russians will not only be able to enter the central part of Konstantinovka, but they'll be also able to access the commie blocks here. And should they be able to take this area of Konstantinovka, then the city is pretty much cooked. Like, it will fall to Russia in the early phase of 2026. And then after that, the Russians will then attempt a push towards Druzhkovka. And speaking of Druzhkovka, the Russians seem like they're now going to begin a proper push from here too. And how they'll do that? It's from the Dobropole direction, or Dobropila. So, what's happening here is that after the capture of Sofivka from the armed forces of Ukraine, the Russians are now trying to fight and capture the village of Turetsky. And should they be able to do this, they'll be able to head north towards Druzhkovka. All these villages here that you see on the map are not defendable, and they will all easily fall to the Russians. And the only place where the Russians will have any big of a challenge or something like that is going to be once they reach Novohrihorivka and Raisky. Once they reach these, then they're probably going to get bogged down there for a while. But other than that, though, I honestly don't know what can really stop the Russians from entering Druzhkovka. And then once they take Druzhkovka, then they're already pretty much in the outskirts of Kramatorsk from the south. And then going into the Dobropole direction, or Dobropila front, that is, the Russians have continued to advance and consolidate their gains east of the strategic town of Beletsky here. Beletsky is what's after Rudensky, and should Russians take Beletsky, then they're on their merry way to Dobropila without that much of an issue, unless, of course, they want to take these series of villages that are south of the city. And we also got to talk about the second elephant in the room, and that is the Pokrovsk front. The Pokrovsk front, or the Krasnaya Amisk direction, is on its last leg. The armed forces of Ukraine are headed for decisive defeat in this area. Now, as you all know, Ukrainians have made some big gains in Kupyansk and have also, I guess, bogged down the Russians a little bit in Liman direction. But the one area where they keep getting their asses whooped is Pokrovsk direction. The Russians have not only captured the city of Pokrovsk, and I have to mention that for the millionth time now because many Ukraine fanboys can't seem to accept that, but also Myanograd, or Dmitriov, as the Russians like to call it as, is also about to fall to Russia. Deep State has colored all these fields here under Russian control, along with the southern portion of Myanograd, or Dmitriov. Myanograd, Dmitriov, whatever. Call it whatever you want. It depends on my mood. But anyway, so yeah, the Russians captured the southern half of Myanograd and have also were advancing from the northeast. And they put 1,000 or so Ukrainians into this big pocket. A pocket that they cannot escape. And even if they were able to, how long before they are sent to another meat grinder? Like Gule-Pule, or maybe Stepnogorsk, maybe in the northeastern Kharkiv direction, Sumy. I mean, how long before they get sent down to another crappy front that they're probably not going to survive? Because if you survive on one front, you're probably just going to die on the next front that they'll send you to. But yeah, so the Russians advanced from these commie blocks here in the tip of the southern half of the city. And from here, they just kept advancing block by block. And it looked like they were going to probably run into some trouble, which they did for a bit, in these commie blocks here in the central part of Leningrad. But now it appears that's not really the case, because Russian FAB bombs were dropping on here like they were going full scorched earth on this city. It's literally being reduced to ruins as we speak right now. And it appears that the FABs have delivered the killing blow to the Ukrainians in Leningrad. And as a result, not only have these commie blocks here fallen to the Russians, but also the biggest commie block neighborhood in the city of Leningrad as well. So all of these areas here, along with these private single-family homes, were all taken by the Russians very easily. So, why all of a sudden the speedy advance? How in the hell did the armed forces of Ukraine collapse in Leningrad so damn quickly? How was this possible? Well, it's fairly simple. Two things happened. Either A, many armed forces of Ukraine troops had surrendered to the Russians en masse, or two, they died. Like, they were killed in battle. And because of one of these two scenarios, and maybe it could be a mixture of both, there's no longer enough Ukrainians to defend Leningrad and the pocket that they're in. And the more territory the Russians take within Leningrad itself, then it will become next to impossible for the Ukrainians to even consider fighting for it. Like, they will just lose all hope. And it also doesn't help that it's freezing cold right now in the former Soviet Union, and there's next to no water, no heat, no food, no nothing for the guys that are fighting for the Ukrainians right now in Leningrad. And it's because of that, the city is collapsing like dominoes. And I wouldn't be surprised if in the next 1 to 2 weeks from now, rather if it be December 19th or December 26th, right after Christmas here in the U.S., that Leningrad is completely gone for the Ukrainians. And to be honest, I think it's going to happen a lot sooner than before Christmas. I think the Ukrainians will lose full control of Leningrad by, I honestly think, just before Christmas. So maybe on the 19th itself, or maybe right before the 25th, somewhere in that time frame, they will lose full control over the city. And then after that, then the Russians will, I guess, maybe go a bit on an operational pause for a bit, and then set up their big logistics hub in Leningrad and Pokrovsk, or Krasnoyarsk. So, with that being said, Ukraine is cooked in central Donetsk region. Their fate has been sealed. And going into next year, the situation will only worsen. Like, it will not get better for them going forward. Because once they lose Leningrad, their time is basically up in the Krasnoyarsk direction. And therefore, Donetsk city is basically out of the full, question. Like, they will never be able to reach it ever again. Even though you could argue that Ukraine's ability to even counterattack or whatsoever within Donetsk region came to an end after last year's full offensives. But I think once this is done, then the Ukrainians will have lost any sort of hope whatsoever of restoring their 1991 borders. I mean, again, you could argue that a ship sailed a long time ago before present day. But I digress. So, with that being said, let's move on to the next front. And that is, of course, Gulay-Pulay/Dnipropetrovsk direction. So the Russians have been dealing with the Ukrainians in this area, specifically in the Dnipropetrovsk direction. And as far as I know, the Ukrainians were able to retake Taiki, but other than that, though, nothing has really happened here that much. There were some weird reports that were circulating around that the Ukrainians had actually been able to recapture some more ground here, but nothing is assured. And because of that, we'll assume that it's either fake or over-exaggerated reports by pro-Ukrainian sources. But other than that, though, it seems as if basically, yeah, for the most part, it's a nothing burger front, and the Vostok Group is now just doubling down on all of its resources and manpower in the city of Gulay-Pulay itself. And to be fair to Vostok Group, they cannot really do much unless they take Gulay-Pulay. Like, until they take this town here, then nothing in this direction here is going to fall to the Russians. Like, they need Gulay-Pulay if they want to keep moving. And that is exactly what they're trying to achieve right now. Because in the last few days or so, it has now been reported that the Russians have taken control over a big chunk of Gulay-Pulay. So, after taking control over the northern part of the town itself, which goes all the way up here to the northwestern part of Gulay-Pulay, the Russians have successfully crossed the Gaitra River and have also begun advancing from the village of Marfalpol. And as a consequence, the Russians already have majority control over eastern Gulay-Pulay. And there's even a isolated report that is circulating across the Russian telegrams right now that they're already fighting and clashing for the town center. And last thing I heard, and I don't know how accurate this is that the Russians are somewhere here, I think. Like in this hospital within the town itself. And if this report were to be confirmed, then the Russians are just 2 blocks away from the Central Rada building in Gulay-Pulay. Now, right now, I think Gulay-Pulay could still fall in December of 2025, and despite their obvious problems in Kupyansk city itself, I think if they were to take Gulay-Pulay before the end of the year, which is, to be quite honest with you guys, kind of a slim possibility, if they're able to take at least most of it, like 75% or so of the town of Gulay-Pulay, then I guess we can say that the Russians had a decent ending to the year. Perhaps. Because once Gulay-Pulay falls, then I honestly don't know what can stop the Russian advances going all the way up to Zaporizhzhia city, other than maybe Orykhov. Because once Orykhov falls, then yeah, the Russians are on their merry way to Zaporizhzhia city, and we will probably see the final fall of Volodymyr Zelensky's government in Kiev. They will literally not recover from losing a cultural symbol like Zaporizhzhia. It literally will not happen. Because if they lose Zaporizhzhia, Ukraine is permanently cooked. Because they have not lost a massive urban area since, like, probably, I think, Severodonetsk and the Lysychansk. You could argue that Pokrovsk and Mianograd combined is as big as Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, but I disagree. They're big, but they're not super big. And I don't know, it just makes sense for me to be, for this to be perhaps where Zelensky's government could fall, in Zaporizhzhia. But it could also be the city of Kharkiv right here. But time will tell on what will happen to Zaporizhzhia in the next 6 to 7 months. But as far as I'm concerned, Gulay-Pulay is probably going to fall either before New Year's itself, or it could fall sometime in January of 2026. Many people are going to say that January is more likely, and to be honest, I don't really blame you if you think that way. But you never know. Ukraine could just collapse here, and that would be it. Or Russians might get bogged down, and they may as well could. Now, one last front to cover before I get going, and that is the Sumy direction. We haven't talked about Sumy in a while, and that's because the front, as we know it, is dead. But what I can report on is that the Russians have retaken ground outside of the villages of Kanrytovka and Andriivka. And they have also retaken some fields outside of the roads going into Yanakovka. Like right here. And once they're able to retake these 2 villages, then maybe they can try going for Khotan again, which, in my opinion, is their biggest roadblock to achieving any further successes in the Sumy direction. But again, as long as there are forested areas here, along with a sizable armed forces of Ukraine, we cannot really expect the Russians to make too much progress in Sumy. That's just not going to happen. And besides, it's been so long that the Russians now have more control of Dnipropetrovsk region than they have of Sumy region. It's been that long. But since the AFU is now super concentrated on trying to retake all of Kupyansk from the Russians, along with also wasting their guys to Ingule Pule, I wouldn't be surprised if the Sumy direction gets significantly weaker, which in turn would make it easier for the Russians to cross the border into Sumy itself. But will they make a bigger effort at taking Sumy? Probably not. I just don't see it. But they will try to ensure that the Ukrainian counterattacks here does not succeed. And I believe that they will achieve this next year in 2026. And that's going to do it for today's video. I hope every single one of you have enjoyed this. I hope you guys like this video. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I want you to comment below what you think. Tell me if you found it informative, entertaining somewhat, whatever. It doesn't matter as long as you say or do something that would boost this video up into the algorithm, because there's a bunch of AI slop channels that are pro-Ukraine and spread lies and get away with it without any consequences. And I would definitely appreciate it if you guys would push this video just a little bit. It doesn't have to be too much, just a little bit, just to get this channel more exposure. So anyway, I'll see you guys all next week. Stay warm because it is freezing cold out here right now. And I'll see you all next time. So take care and peace out. Bye-bye.